Okay, well, folks, I think we'll go ahead and get started now. Welcome, 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 everybody. Hope you're all doing well in your lockdowns and that you are managing to get out and get some exercise. We were absolutely thrilled that Rabbi Elton has agreed to give this talk. I, for one, was very upset that I wasn't able to go to Limud and they did not put it online. And we're very grateful that he is doing this. I'm not going to talk for a long time. The title is The Misunderstood Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, His Life and Legacy. If you have, Rabbi is going to speak for about 40 minutes and then leave 20 minutes for questions. You'll either be able to ask your questions in person or you can type your question into the chat box at the bottom of the screen. So without any further ado, Rabbi Elton, please go ahead and get started. And once again, thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. And I hope, as Sharon said, everyone is coping as well as they can with the lockdown. And I want to say thanks to Sharon for immediately when they announced the lockdown, making a suggestion of giving this presentation over Zoom. And just to reiterate, anything that anyone needs from myself or my captain of the shul, just please be in touch. We're around, we're working, and we're here to look after you as well as we can. I'm speaking this afternoon about Rabbi Sacks, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the late chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth, who passed away just a few months ago. And I want to begin, as I began at Limud, with the two vignettes which really bracket my experience of Rabbi Sacks. And I think in retrospect, he was the most important rabbinic figure of the first 40 years of my life. Even though I had only sporadic interactions with him in person, nevertheless, the shadow he cast over the Orthodox world and the Jewish world more generally was so tremendous that he really was the colossus in rabbinic terms of the past 30 or 40 years. So the first vignette goes back to my childhood when I was 10 years old, and he was asked to be the Wreath lecturer in 1990. He was at that point not yet chief rabbi. He was the principal of Jews College, which to be honest was a fairly small and not particularly important rabbinical college in international terms. And yet, even from that position, which was not a position of great eminence in terms of wider British society or international Jewish society, nevertheless, his personal brilliance, his personal qualities were already so evident that he was asked to give the flagship series of lectures broadcast across the Britain and the rest of the world by the BBC. And he had established himself as one of the leading public intellectuals, even though at that stage he was only in his early 40s. And there was a very powerful experience, which I had and many other people had, of turning on Radio 4, the most important spoken word radio channel in Britain, and hearing a rabbi speak not just to the Jewish community, but to the entire nation. Somebody had been chosen to share their wisdom and insights with the whole country. We knew that the chief rabbi wrote occasional articles in national newspapers, or was given a slot to speak to the Jewish community via the BBC before the high holidays. But to have as the Wreath lecturer a rabbi was a very thrilling experience. And even though it was difficult at the age of 10 to follow all of his arguments and what he was trying to say, nevertheless, just the experience of a rabbi being chosen to have that very prestigious position and role was a very important experience to me. And so when he became chief rabbi, he already had acquired that level of respect within the Jewish community, of course, and beyond the Jewish community. That was 1990. And then in about 2013 or 14, at that point, he had retired from the chief rabbinate, and he had taken up two posts in New York, at least part-time. One was as visiting professor at Yeshiva University, the leading modern Orthodox institution in the Jewish world, and also, perhaps more remarkably, as visiting professor at New York University, not a Jewish institution, although an institution with a lot of Jews in it, but also given an equal status in that non-Jewish university. And this meant he spent quite a lot of his time in New York, and he would visit the different shuls in New York and speak on Shabbos and other occasions at those shuls. And so one Shabbos, he came to spend his time on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, where I lived and where the shul I worked at, Lincoln Square Synagogue, is located. And there are many important shuls, all within a mile or two of each other. And so over the course of Shabbat, he spent different services at different places, Friday night, Shabbat morning. And he came to Lincoln Square Synagogue on Shabbos afternoon, and the place was packed. The place looked like it would look on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. People crowding in to hear him speak and to ask him questions and to interact with him. And I had the great privilege of sitting with him on his visit to Lincoln Square Synagogue and seeing the tremendous respect in which he was held and the power of his presence, his charisma, and the eminence to which he had risen. And it's true that in every external sense, he had acquired, by the end of his life and the end of his chief rabbinate, every honor that one could possibly look for from his career. Chief rabbi, endless honorary doctorates, visiting professorships, a knighthood, a peerage. But less tangibly than that, was regarded, I think, at that stage, not as the emeritus chief rabbi of the Commonwealth, but really as the chief rabbi of the world. I think de facto, at the end of his life, he'd transcended any particular community, and actually any particular denomination, one even might say, even the bounds of orthodoxy, which is slightly paradoxical, considering what I'm about to say, but had become really the leading Jewish figure in the world, and certainly the leading Orthodox figure in the world. And that's really how he ended his life, much sooner than we would have wished, considering his contribution that was still to be given, but nevertheless, an extraordinary position. But at the center, I think, of this enormous regard for Rabbi Sacks is a fundamental misunderstanding of his personal, ideological, and to some extent religious position. And in fact, the troubles that he faced as chief rabbi, and he faced many more troubles as chief rabbi than after he was chief rabbi, came, I think, not from anything he did himself, but the way his actions contrasted with the perceptions people had of him. And those perceptions, I think, were wrong in the way they were held both by what one might call the left and what one might call the right. Both of those two segments misunderstood who he was and reacted to him in particular ways because of that misunderstanding. And it boils down to this, I think, that people thought he was a liberal, and in fact, he was a conservative. The perception of Rabbi Sacks is that he was a proponent of a orthodoxy for sure, was a liberal orthodoxy, and had, generally speaking, a liberal attitude towards social issues. But in fact, he was, I think, in the vanguard of a growing conservative movement. And this is particularly interesting to think about in this moment in the development of public discourse, because just as there is the rise of what's been called, or people identify as, the woke tendency, critical race theory, the increasing militancy and radicalism of the left, there's also, I think, an equal and opposite reaction in the right. One has the rise of figures like Jordan Peterson and Douglas Murray, and rather less subtly, Ben Shapiro, and within the Jewish world, people like Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik. Some of these names might be familiar to people, others not necessarily. But the right is now also more strident, also more outspoken, also more radical. In some senses, the Trump presidency was a testimony to a rise in the right and a dissatisfaction on the right with the new form of the left. And I think, although he's very much more subtle than many of these figures that I've described, Rabbi Sacks was in the vanguard of this conservative response and reaction. But of course, his response does not date to the early 2000s, although he has something to say about the period we're living in now, but it goes all the way back to the 1970s. 1960s, 1970s, that's when his turn to the right comes. But first, just to lay out a little more in detail why one might think that he was a man of the liberal left as opposed to a man of the conservative right. Well, first of all, his personal background. He was not from a religious family. He was from a traditional Jewish family in northwest London. You know, they went to shul, I'm not sure how often. He was part of, a shul community growing up. He had his bar mitzvah, but by no means were they observant. He went to Christ College, which is a non-Jewish school in Finchley. That's where he had his early education. He went off to Cambridge to study philosophy. And as he himself said, philosophy and religion in the 1960s were like oil and water. They were considered totally incompatible. He became more attached to Judaism in his time at Cambridge. The story is told that in 1967, war broke out between Israel and its Arab neighbors, the Six-Day War. And like many of the Jews who were at Cambridge at the time, he went to the Cambridge synagogue and prayed for the safety of Israel and the people of Israel. Another person who went at that time, as I mentioned, at Limud, was Simon Sharma, who also had a lifetime commitment to the Jewish story, Jewish community, even though he didn't take such a religious turn. But for Rabbi Sacks, something clearly stuck. He went beyond simply going to pray in a time of emergency. And he went to America as a teenage student and tried to see some of the most important rabbinic figures of that time in America. It's often sort of pointed out, he went to see Rabbi Soloveitchik. Not necessarily what one call a left-wing figure, but nevertheless somebody very, very deeply immersed in the whole of the Western canon, and particularly the Western philosophical canon. So at this stage already, we see somebody who has a very strong general background, general educational background, secular background, didn't attend a yeshiva of a classic sort, a philosophy student, a philosophy scholar, who's made a connection with another great rabbi who's also engaged in Western philosophy. It's clear from very, very early on that Rabbi Sacks had vast reading, continued to read at an extraordinary pace and rate all throughout his career. So all this indicates that he's not going to be a classic, a rabbi of the classic traditional school, which one might translate into being therefore rather more liberal. There was also early involvement in two institutions which also were not compatible with a traditional rabbinic stance. One was Leo Baeck College, which was still is the rabbinic college of the British Reform movement, where he taught Talmud to the students. So he didn't teach theology or Jewish law, but he was perfectly prepared to teach Talmud to the students. And also Limud, the non-denominational learning festival, which started in Britain. He was present at all of the early meetings at Limud. He stopped going to Limud when he became chief rabbi. But before then, he did not object to teaching in a non-denominational setting. He just wished to teach Torah to whoever was willing to listen. That was all before his chief rabbinate. And then the great event of his chief rabbinate, which might indicate that he had a more liberal approach, was a book called Dignity of Difference, which was written and published in the wake of 9/11, and was arguing essentially that there was no reason why we should have to believe that a clash of civilizations was inevitable and was unavoidable, and that the different faiths in the world could indeed come to an accommodation. And this became controversial because he said that God had spoken to Jews through Judaism and Christians through Christianity and Muslims through Islam. And this seemed to be a relativistic approach to religion that did not claim that Judaism was unique or was a special sort of revelation, was different to anything else. It seemed remarkably pluralist. And this is what attracted to him the greatest wrath of the right wing, in Britain especially, but also to some extent around the world, and it was condemned and had to issue a revised version of the book with certain passages amended. And so the right in particular looked at him and said, here we have somebody who didn't go to our yeshivot, who doesn't have our background, who seems to have read everything in the Western philosophical and literary canon, who had some engagement with Leo Beck College, with Limud, who's writing about God speaking to Christians through Christianity, and so on and so forth. Here is somebody of the left. Here is somebody not really one of us, not a conservative, not like his predecessor, Lord Jacobowitz, who was very clearly identified as a social conservative. Here is somebody on the liberal side of an analysis of society. And that also, I think, persuaded the liberals to think the same thing. The liberals saw somebody who had the same background they did, had been to an elite university, who took secular study very seriously, who looked like them and sounded like them, who was very comfortable on Radio 4, very comfortable in the pages of the Times. They regarded him as one of us, just like we are liberal, so he too is a liberal. And this impression that he made, or people inferred, led to moments of disappointment. So while the right was enraged that he published Dignity of Difference with those supposedly pluralistic statements within, the left was very disappointed and very crestfallen that he withdrew and revised, and was disappointed and astonished and confused why that had happened. It was also the most difficult event of his chief rabbinate from the point of view of his supporters on the left, which was the death of Hugo Gryn. Hugo Gryn was a Holocaust survivor, was the leading reform rabbi in Great Britain, was a leading intellectual and public spokesman for Judaism and for faith and morality. And when he died, Rabbi Sacks did not attend his funeral. As the chief rabbi of the Orthodox community, he did not attend the funeral of the leading rabbi of the Reform community. Well, this attracted an enormous amount of criticism, and so he then attended the memorial service. There was a memorial service sometime later on, and he attended that, which then elicited a backlash from the right. And this is when it all went terribly wrong. If things weren't bad enough already, having alienated the left and the right over the death of Hugo Gryn and its subsequent memorializations, he then signed a letter to the head of the Hadass, the right-wing synagogue grouping in London, saying that he only attended the memorial service for political reasons, and that really he had no truck with somebody who he regarded as having been someone who destroyed the faith. So he was a man who was considered, almost saint-like, and a Holocaust survivor. And Rabbi Sacks was writing in very harsh terms in rabbinic Hebrew to a figure on the right. And in fact, to my mind, very unfairly, because we all make mistakes and we all do things we regret, he was forced to relive this unfortunate incident for the rest of his chief rabbinate and the rest of his life. There's no question that his very strong words did do him a lot of damage with those on the left. They couldn't understand why somebody who seemed so broad should take this view. More publicly, he condemned Louis Jacobs in the 1990s. Louis Jacobs was the founder of Masorti, or conservative Judaism, in the United Kingdom, and it started in London, and there were moves to spread to different cities during the 1990s, and there was an idea to set up a Masorti congregation in Manchester. And Rabbi Sacks wrote a very strong article as chief rabbi calling the Masorti intellectual thieves. Now, exactly why he critiqued them on that basis, I'm not sure, but that's very strong language. And again, people were very disappointed. In fact, Louis Jacobs, I think, or at least according to his followers, kind of believed that Rabbi Sacks was more of his way of thinking than of the way of the thinking of the Orthodox, and so was particularly hurt that Rabbi Sacks attacked him, and felt that if he'd been in quote unquote honest, he would have actually been a follower of Louis Jacobs as opposed to a member of the Orthodox establishment. Again, somebody on the left thinking that really Rabbi Sacks was one of us. And then right in the chief rabbinate, the government was collecting statements on whether they should allow same-sex marriage. And the London Beth Din, of which Rabbi Sacks, as chief rabbi, was the official head, wrote a piece of evidence, submission, saying that they oppose same-sex marriage. And again, there was all sorts of pilpul, which is the yeshivish term for intellectual gymnastics. Really, they wrote it, he didn't really agree with it, he had to agree, he wasn't able. It was never considered that maybe he actually agreed, maybe he himself was against same-sex marriage. So one can look at these incidents as exceptions that have to be explained by the left, explained away, to return to an understanding that Rabbi Sacks actually was a figure of the liberal analysis of society. Or you can say, no, fundamentally these reflected his fundamental points of view, and that he wasn't frog marched by the right towards certain positions. They expressed who he actually was, and that he actually was a conservative and not a liberal. Now, how does he become a conservative, and how can we see that? Well, I mentioned he went to see Rabbi Soloveitchik when he went to New York in 1968. And he said that Rabbi Soloveitchik taught me or told me or set me an example of how to think. But the figure who had a much greater effect on him, much greater impact on him, and I think really is the key to his whole religious outlook, is Lubavitcher Rebbe. He went to see the Lubavitcher Rebbe and he said, the Rebbe taught me not so much how to think, but how to lead. And he told Rabbi Sacks, you should be a rabbi, which was his intention at the time, and you should be a teacher of rabbis. In other words, become the principal of Jews College and become the chief rabbi if it ever comes your way. Clearly, the Rebbe could see his tremendous personal qualities. Now, the Rebbe had a collection of very interesting positions. So Lubavitch Chabad, of course, is tremendously connected to the wider Jewish world, and to some extent to the wider world in general. They will teach anybody, they will look after anybody, they will try and increase the Jewish connection of anybody. They don't know boundaries, which of course why in some cities you find Chabad young men on the street corners putting tefillin on people. Whichever Jew comes by, it doesn't matter to them, they want to reach as many people as possible. But in their own personal conduct, in their own personal Judaism, there is still a rigid traditionalism. So there's a combination of interest in and outreach to the wider Jewish world, and every Jew is their concern, but that doesn't lead to any compromise or any moderation of the way in which they live themselves, in their customs, in their dress, in their philosophical positions. Now, it's true that Rabbi Sacks didn't accept this the whole gamut, in the sense that he remained a scholar of many areas of secular study, and he encouraged that for the people as well. But I think the key to understanding Rabbi Sacks, one of the two keys is that he believed in an orthodoxy, a fairly uncompromising orthodoxy, for himself and for others as an ideal, while wishing to reach out to as many people as possible. Now, that doesn't mean that the secular study and the secular quotations were window dressing, not at all. I think he did fully accept the more Soloveitchik approach of being open to all wisdom, maybe even as the Rebbe himself was open to all wisdom, if not necessarily all of his followers. However, he did believe that orthodoxy was the best way, and in fact, fundamentally the only way, the only legitimate approach to Judaism he believed was orthodoxy. And while others were always proper focuses of one's attention, that doesn't mean that their approach was equally valid. He wrote a very important book, which I don't think is particularly well remembered now, but to me is his most important book, called One People, which he wrote more or less as he started as chief rabbi, and was a sort of platform or manifesto for his chief rabbinate. And in One People, he makes the argument that we have to approach the creation of an Orthodox community with as much openness as possible, to allow as many people as possible to enter into it and find a home there. So we shouldn't set particularly high standards. So whereas in the pre-modern period, only people who kept Shabbat would be called to the Torah, let's say, and that would exclude a very great number of people from any sort of religious ritual involvement in synagogue life. So that obviously isn't appropriate if you want to create an inclusive and open and broad community. And that would, of course, include anybody from any denomination, as long as they were halakhically Jewish. It doesn't matter that somebody has the label of a Reformed Jew or a Masorti Jew. They are a Jew, and therefore they have to be given a place. But, he said, their ideologies can't be given a place. There can be no recognition of the equal validity of Reformed Judaism or Conservative Judaism. We accept all people as an Orthodox community, but we don't accept all ideologies. In fact, we have to look at people as being without the ideologies that they themselves believe they carry. And we regard them without the ideology, which might be very important to them. So if a Reform rabbi walks into your shul, this is not necessarily his example, it's my example, then they're just a Jew walking in, and you regard them as you would regard any Jew. You don't pay attention to their rabbinic affiliation or their personal religious affiliation. Now that is quite a radical and quite strident approach. It's packaged in, and I don't mean to by saying that I don't mean to say that it's cynical. I think it's genuine. It's packaged within a great openness to people, but it's very hard line when it comes to defining what's legitimate Judaism, what isn't legitimate Judaism. It's saying there is a right way and a wrong way. Our way, the Orthodox way, is the right way, and all others are wrong. Doesn't mean you exclude people, but it can hardly be called pluralist or liberal in its approach to other denominations. So you have to take that seriously as a piece of writing. Now that's within Orthodoxy, within Judaism. What about further afield, more broadly, in terms of how he regarded other faiths, the wider community of faith and the wider community? Well, I think that this is actually the point where there was an element of tension between his conservatism and his religious traditionalism, because conservatism in a general sense from the 1960s is pushing back against atheism and secularism. In fact, he described himself to his rather disappointed doctoral supervisor, Bernard Williams, very distinguished atheist philosopher. When he was disappointed that Rabbi Sacks had become religious, he said, "Don't worry, think of me as a lapsed atheist." He dedicated himself to pushing back against the riding tide of atheism and secularism. But that means that you need an alliance. Jews alone are not going to be able to turn the tide of secularism and atheism in society. We're too small. What you need is a broad alliance of all people of faith. And therefore, although dignity of difference was prompted initially by 9/11, this terrible conflict that seemed to be coming between the Muslim world and the Christian world, or the Judeo-Christian world, in fact, I think it has much deeper roots. And it was the same ideas were expressed again in another book called To Heal a Fractured World, which is not written under the imminent impact of 9/11. And in those books, he's arguing that all people of faith can come together and champion shared values. And he talks in other places about the Judeo-Christian tradition. Now that to me is quite controversial, because from a Jewish point of view, what are the commonalities fundamentally between Judaism and Christianity? Christianity came out of Judaism, but is there really a fully worked out sort of shared platform between Jews and Christians? Quite often I'm asked to sign on to letters written by the churches about abortion or stem cell research or IVF, and I can't do so because the Jewish position is different. However, on important occasions, he did invoke this concept of a Judeo-Christian ethic, because I think as a conservative, as a social conservative, he was very committed to holding the line for traditional societies based on traditional systems of belief and thought, and holding the line against a materialist, secular, atheist approach to the world. In fact, his very last book, which was called Morality, published just before he died, is very interesting. We had this book in the Great Synagogue Book Club, and I led the discussion. And I remarked then that there's nothing specific, almost nothing specifically Jewish about the book. He quotes from a very great range of sources, some of which are Jewish, but they don't particularly stand out in terms of there being many more Jewish sources than non-Jewish sources. And for much of the book, he seems to be arguing he is arguing not for a divine morality given to a particular people or contained in a particular text, but really any grounded system of social rules. His definition of morality, in my view, if you work it through the book, is a set of stable rules which support a well-functioning society and fruitful interactions between different people to make up that society. In other words, his argument isn't principally for Judaism. Now you might say, well, that's because it wasn't a book primarily for a Jewish audience. But that in turn begs the question, why was he writing such a broader book? Why was he making an argument for the whole world, essentially, the whole Western world? Because as a social conservative, he saw the dangers of these trends towards secularization, which he believed broke up people, atomized society, kicked away the supports which people need, which human beings need, which makes human beings flourish. And that's a very, very fundamental conservative insight, that human beings need the structures built up over centuries organically in order to flourish most effectively. That we don't want to, in like the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, to sweep everything away and try and set up things on a so-called rational basis. That's never going to work. We have to work within the structures which human beings have built up organically, and those include the structures of morality, social rules, the accepted regulations which govern communities, which have come up over many, many years. That is a fundamental conservative insight. Now that comes into conflict or tension, at least with traditional Judaism, because there is indeed a hesitancy about coming forward and saying all religions are equal in this sense or in any sense. Judaism does, in its traditional form, impose a hierarchy. You know, in as much as religion is monotheism, that gets a tick. But if that monotheism is compromised by having, let's say, a trinity, it gets a black mark. Or if it has a prophet who we don't believe has received a true revelation, like Muhammad, it gets a black mark. To say that all religions are in receipt of some sort of divine revelation, divine message, that's very important as a sort of pan-conservative argument for having stable traditional societies, but it is in tension with a traditional Jewish analysis. And so I think that's in fact where his conservatism tripped up his Jewish traditionalism. And I think he probably was experimenting at the edges of what he felt he was able to say, may have felt he went a little too far, and that's why he wrote back. He may have felt he was too enthusiastic in his putting of that point of view. It's interesting to see who he associated with during his life. At the end, he was talking with and to and about people like Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson and Meir Soloveichik. These were the people he was associating with, people very much on this new wave of the right. But even early people who were considered to be progressives in their day, if you look at them more closely, were also conservative figures. For example, he was very close to two prime ministers, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and close to the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles. Now, of course, Brown and Blair were from the Labour Party, are from the Labour Party in Britain, are on the left. But at the same time, Blair became a baptized Catholic just after he left 10 Downing Street and ceased to be Prime Minister. Gordon Brown was also very deeply rooted in the idea of stable communities leading to good outcomes for young people. They were not Labour, they were New Labour. They wanted to combine a progressive approach to economics, which recognized people fall behind and have to be helped out, with the creation of strong communities with strong rules. There was very little tolerance, zero tolerance for teenage sort of misbehavior, youth crime. All these became very intensely tackled by the Labour Party in that period. Prince Charles, in a similar way, was advocating traditional communities. He was saying we have to get away from tower blocks and brutalist architecture and create spaces to live in which are friendly to the growth of communities in a traditional sense, where you live and where you shop and the people you meet, not in cars but on foot. These are all encouraged organically by the architecture around you, and things should be beautiful in a way which is instinctive to men and women, and not rationally planned in a way that actually goes against the grain of human behavior. Again, a conservative, organic, developmental approach to how society ought to be organized. So this, as I said, this wasn't recognized, I think, so much during his lifetime because of his wide learning, and because of the great polish of his presentation. He could have been a public intellectual from any background in some of the ways that he was viewed. Intellectuals were associated with being liberals and being on the left, but I think he was a highly refined, nuanced, and polished figure who is in fact comes from the right. And it's interesting to think what he could have contributed had he still been around. We were in this book, Morality. He was already really arguing against cancel culture, against woke culture, against social media as opposed to human relationships. These are all ideas which come from a more conservative, more traditional point of view. And I think if the next 10 or 20 years he comes to be seen as an early harbinger of these more conservative themes, pushing against other ideas which have been powerful since the 1960s, then I think that'll be a new slant. And I think he'd be very happy about that, because his entire career was really spent arguing for the place of faith in modern society, the family, tradition, societal structure, received orthodoxies, received traditions. That's how he dedicated his life. And I think once that's fully appreciated, he will be more appreciated both by those on the left and by those on the right. That's the first part of my my presentation. And now, as Sharon said, very happy to take about 20 minutes of questions.
If you'd like to ask a question, if you can just unmute yourself. Rabbi, may I start with the first question, please? In the latest Jewish news, there's an article about the London School of Jewish Studies where they revoked the honorary title of research fellow from a woman, Dr. Lindsay Taylor Goodhartz, because she obtained smicha from the Maharat Orthodox Rabbinical School in New York. So Rabbi Ephraim Mervis was he was the one who asked her to leave. In your opinion, what do you think Rabbi Sacks would have done in this circumstance?
Well, of course, one can never tell, but I think his inclination was certainly against an institution such as Maharat. If you look at the position of women in the United States Synagogue during his time as chief rabbi, it did not advance. He was very much in favor of women's education, but then so was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. But he was not in favor of women's leadership, I think either lay leadership or religious leadership. So he did not allow women to become the honorary officers of the United Synagogue for his entire period in office, although Rabbi Mervis, as soon as he came in, did allow that. Although Rabbi Jakovitz before him, who has this reputation of being conservative, allowed women in a women's tefillah group, as in Sydney, to use the Sefer Torah, Rabbi Sacks did not give permission for the women's tefillah group to use a Sefer Torah. He was conservative on women's issues, and I think while he thought, that the wife of the rabbi could perform a useful role, he was not in favor actually of formal leadership roles for women. Actually, a woman ran his office, interesting. So there was a very powerful woman at the center of the chief rabbinate, but it was a behind the scenes role. As far as I can tell, I don't think he did anything to promote the public role of women, either in a lay or a religious capacity. That's the first point. The second point is that during and after his chief rabbinate, he never ever allied himself with the left wing of Orthodoxy. So he was always a YU affiliated person. My own yeshiva, Chovei Torah, YCT, he didn't visit. He had nothing to do with, wasn't interested in. Maharat, although it's a sort of sister institution, is arguably even to the left of YCT, has a different faculty and so on. So it can have a slightly different identity, even though it comes from the same stable. And I'm sure he'd have been very skeptical about Maharat as an institution. It's interesting to me that Rabbi Mervis has taken this quite radical decision to say she has to leave her post. And I think that's actually because he's somewhat conservative. Rabbi Mervis is somewhat conservative and isn't mistaken for a liberal. I think he wears his conservatism on his sleeve. But he has founded a program called Ma'ayan, which trains women in Jewish content and gives them a title. Ma'ayan means spring, a spring of water. So he is trying to create his own program for women's spiritual leadership. And one thing you have to do if you're doing something slightly edgy like that is to make sure you're very distant from anything which is further to its left. So, here and no further. What I'm doing is kosher, therefore what they're doing is treif. So I think there's a certain amount of that going on. Rabbi Sacks himself did not set up a program like Ma'ayan for women in the community, and I think would have been very, very skeptical. But at the same time, I think he was quite good at letting sleeping dogs lie and sort of disassociating himself. So he might well not have intervened. He might well have just sort of shrugged his shoulders.
Very interesting. Thank you. Now, if anybody else would like to ask a question, Anne Sarzen.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rabbi Elton. I'd like to ask you, if one accepts your thesis that he was a social conservative, a religious conservative, and walking a tightrope between competing ideologies on the left and the right, wouldn't you say then that it was an enormously courageous thing to do, to rise above that turbulence, that ideological turbulence, and present a message of universalism to the world, such as we saw in morality, where he suggested a new ethical structure for life?
Not necessarily. I don't think it's courageous. I think he was very articulately pursuing his ideological aims, which are the world needs traditional morality, which could be a Christian morality or a Jewish morality or a Muslim morality. It needs traditional societies, traditional structures, and basically most of our ethics are all the same anyway. If you look at the great religions, most of the basic ethical foundations, fidelity, honesty, compassion, kindness, practical kindness, these are all the same things. Connectivity, connection between people. This is what all societies really are based on, traditional societies, and we need more of those values of traditional society. So, he did it very powerfully and eloquently and effectively in terms of people being, recognizing the brilliance of what he was saying. In terms of how it changed society, it's a different matter. But it was countercultural to some extent. So he's a countercultural figure. He's a traditional figure in a non-traditional age. But that was his ideological, project for himself, and he was still carrying it out all the way through, right to the end.
Thank you,
Rabbi. We have
Dasha, can I ask a question? I'll send a question. In the chapter on meaning in morality, he refers to redemption of suffering in terms of Stephen Jobs as an example. I thought that this is a strictly Christian notion. redemption of suffering?
Well, in the idea that one man's suffering can redeem the world is Christian, of course, but there is and it's extremely delicate, but there is a Jewish stream or thoughts which do occur in post-war Jewish thinkers that at least suffering can be used for something better that follows. So the state of Israel is not, the Holocaust is not justified because it led to Israel. You could say no Holocaust, no Israel. That's probably true in terms of historical cause and effect. Does that mean the Holocaust was, in quote unquote, worth it to create Israel? No, it doesn't. But you can say, having endured the Holocaust, we have to make sure that we have a place in the world where we're secure and we're looking after our own future. And we're going to use the insight provided by that terrible tragedy to make sure it doesn't happen again. So I think that's what he means by the redemption of suffering. You can take the suffering you have and you can make it useful, as opposed to the suffering itself having sort of metaphysical power to redeem the world or to change anything. It's what we do with our suffering that matters.
Rabbi, there's a question here in the chat box from Yana. What was Rabbi Sacks's view on art and Judaism? Would he, for example, have his portrait painted?
His portrait was painted, but fairly early on, I think. There's a portrait in Jewish College, now the London School of Jewish Studies, of Rabbi Sacks. I don't think he was a very visual person at all. I don't think he was much interested in aesthetics at all. He'd like to quote Rav Kook, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Mandate Palestine, said something rather beautiful, which Sacks like to quote. The verse says, "Or zaror latzadik ule yishrei leiv simcha," that light is sown for the righteous and joy for the upright in heart. So what's this light is sown for the righteous? So the rabbis say that the light which appeared on the first day of creation before the sun was created, what was that light? That wasn't light created by the sun, that was a sort of divine light. And when the sun was created, the light was put away, but it was retained for the righteous. The righteous have access to the light of the first day of creation, which the rest of us don't see. We see the light from the sun. And Rav Kook said when he went to see Rembrandt in the National Gallery in London, and he saw the way that Rembrandt painted light, he said Rembrandt saw the Or Zaror Latzadik. He saw the light which was put away when the sun was created and was only reserved for the righteous. So Rav Kook said that, Rabbi Sacks liked to quote it. Whether he himself was much interested himself in going to the National Gallery, I don't really think. I think he was a wordsman.
But what was his view on the second commandment, of the ban on images?
Yes, I mean, very strong. And yes, I think both strong. It's easier to be strong than that if you're not interested in general in the artistic enterprise.
Mm.
I think also, he was not somebody.
I think he was very conservative in that view.
Yes, and I think also, if you take something which interests you and me, Jana, and other people, which is synagogue architecture, I don't think he had any interest really in beautiful synagogues. And again, this is something which I think is connected to Lubavitch. I mean, first of all, intellectuals generally don't seem to be very interested in sort of beautiful surroundings. They just need, a desk and a book, and they're fine. And if you look at 770, the headquarters of Chabad, it was very simple, rather shabby, plywood, laminate, nothing of any aesthetic interest. And I think that's what he felt too. And he felt that the grand synagogues of London, if they weren't performing a function, they were of no interest to him. He wasn't sentimental about beautiful buildings. He was interested in ideas and people.
Thank you.
Any other questions? If you do, unmute yourself and...
It's Roz.
Hi, Roz.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on Alex's iPad. Mine's not working. Rabbi, you said that he was not for women to have roles in Orthodoxy, either lay or religious. I found complete opposite. When he came to visit, Sydney during my presidency, which was between 2005 and 2009. I think it was 2006, if I remember, he was here. He actually stood up, well, he was there in front of 800 people and said, it's wonderful to see a woman as president. And then when I was speaking to his wife the next day at a National Council of Jewish Women function, I said, why is it that there is no woman who is a president of synagogue in United Synagogues in Britain? And she said, well, they leave the chair empty and then she can be a vice president, but that's the only way that it can happen. And she thought it was rather silly too. So I don't really feel that he was against it, but I do think he had his hands tied behind his back because of the Beth Din, and probably they were against it. And the second time he came to Sydney during Michael Gold's presidency, I was at that time president of the Council of Orthodox Synagogues of New South Wales and was having a few problems. I won't say what exactly, but he gave me 15 minutes of his time one-on-one at a particular meeting of presidents and other communal heads. And I thought that was rather special, and I was very fortunate to have his wisdom one-on-one. So I found him very accepting of my role.
He was very, very generous with his time. So speaking to rabbis of my generation who went to him for advice, he was very generous with his time. When he was at NYU and YU, he would see the students for like 10 minutes each and was very generous with his time. So there's no question about that. I would only say it's easier to stand up, if you're the chief rabbi in London, it's easy to stand up in Sydney and say, isn't it wonderful that you have a woman president? But when he went back to London, he didn't say, all right, lads, we better have some women presidents around here.
No.
In fact, I heard, and I can't remember the exact source of this, but I was told that he once said, my rabbi, who was Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich, who also died recently, who was his teacher of Talmud at Jews College, he said, he says that it's all right to have a woman president, but I'm not going to do it. And, you know, for most of his career, people said, oh, he would like to do X or Y, but the Beth Din are tying his hands. I think he probably would have liked to go to Limud, because like Chabad, he wants to teach all Jews everywhere, whenever he can. But I think in other issues, I think we have to believe in his own, that he was actually, he was pursuing his own beliefs. And he, you know, having women presence might be good for Sydney, but he might have felt in London, where, you know, more traditional structures are still in place, there was no need to change them. It's all right for us colonials, Ross.
Okay, we have time for one more question. If anybody has, now's your chance. Unmute yourself and
be heard.
And be heard.
Can I ask the last question? Just
of course, Anne.
If you had to crystallize your view of his enduring legacy, what would it be?
I think his great legacy will be his commentaries. That his commentaries to the Siddur and the holiday prayer books, and I think maybe even eventually a Chumash might appear. I think ultimately he was a teacher, and explaining Judaism to the Jews will be something which lasts for a very long time. So Rabbi Hertz, his predecessor chief rabbi, you know, he was very much involved in many of the controversies of the age. What survives really? The Hertz Chumash, the way he taught Judaism to Jews. And I think Rabbi Sacks was very much in dialogue with the issues of his time, particularly secularism and materialism, and those will wane as our arguments move to different topics over the years, as they inevitably do. The importance of those books will wane, but the importance of what he did at the end of his life, also covenant and conversation, you know, explaining the weekly parasha to the community through weekly essays, blending in Jewish and non-Jewish sources, that I think in 10 or 15 years' time, that will be the great legacy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. I have to tell you, there are lots and lots of messages in the chat box of thanks from people who are attending and how much they're enjoying it. Thank you all for those messages. Folks, the Great Synagogue is putting on several other Zoom sessions for as long as we're in lockdown. So please either go to the website or to our Facebook page or our Instagram. We'd love to see you all there. Rabbi Elton, thank you so much. This was absolutely wonderful, everything I thought it would be, and we're all so very grateful that you have done this talk for us.
It was my great pleasure, and stay cheerful, everybody.
Yes.